Welcome to News and Box Updates. Please subscribe and hit the bell icon for more breaking updates. January 23, 2026. The world awoke to a day thick with anticipation, the kind of tension that seemed to hum in the air, felt in every corner of the globe. It was a date circled on calendars not just in Washington, but in boardrooms, trading floors, and kitchen tables from New York to Shanghai. Tension gripped the world's financial centers. The usual morning bustle was replaced by a nervous energy, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting for a signal that would determine the fate of markets and livelihoods. From Wall Street to Tokyo, one question dominated every conversation. Would this be the day the Supreme Court ruled on the Trump tariffs? The uncertainty was global, and the stakes were impossible to ignore. Investors, CEOs, and governments waited, knowing trillions of dollars in the future of global commerce hung in the balance. Every decision, from hiring to expansion, was put on hold as leaders weighed the risks of acting before the verdict. The world watched a high-stakes legal drama unfold. News anchors spoke in hushed tones, analysts speculated endlessly, and ordinary people tried to make sense of what it all meant for their daily lives. Traders hovered over their screens, markets swinging wildly with every rumor. A single tweet or leaked memo could send stocks soaring or crashing, as uncertainty became the only constant. Each day without a verdict deepened the uncertainty, stalling investments and forcing businesses to plan for conflicting futures. Some companies drafted multiple budgets each, based on a different possible outcome, while others simply waited, paralyzed by indecision. The silence from the Supreme Court became a market force of its own. With every hour that passed, the lack of a decision sent new ripples of anxiety through the global economy. It was more than an economic debate. It was a moment with real-world consequences. Families felt the pinch at the grocery store, and workers wondered if their jobs would survive the next wave of uncertainty. The case questioned the president's authority to impose sweeping tariffs, either to dismantle a core Trump policy or cement it for future presidents. The outcome would not only shape trade, but also redefine the limits of executive power for generations. The stakes touched everything from grocery prices to global supply chains. A single ruling could mean relief for some, or new hardships for others, as the world's economic engine sputtered in uncertainty. Every day of waiting meant more instability for a world already on edge. The longer the silence, the deeper the cracks in confidence, as leaders and citizens alike wondered how much more uncertainty they could withstand. The anticipation was like waiting for a hurricane, its path and power unknown. Everyone braced for impact, but no one could say when, or how, it would arrive. Markets, desperate for clarity, found only chaos in the court's silence. Volatility became the new normal, and even the most seasoned investors struggled to predict what would come next. Boardrooms froze expansion plans, factory workers worried about their jobs. Across industries, the uncertainty seeped into every decision, every conversation, every hope for the future. The world wasn't just watching, it was waiting for a decision that would redefine the rules for decades. In that tense pause, the fate of economies, governments, and everyday lives hung suspended, as the world stood on the edge of history. To truly grasp the significance of the Supreme Court's looming decision, we need to look beyond the marble columns and black robes. At the heart of this legal battle lies a powerful tool, one that has shaped economies, influenced global alliances, and sparked fierce debate for centuries. The tariff. A tariff, in its simplest form, is a tax placed on goods that cross a country's border. But it's much more than just a line item on a customs form. Tariffs are designed to make imported products more expensive, giving an edge to domestic industries and, in theory, protecting local jobs. When you walk through a store and see a Made in America label, you're seeing the result of a long history of tariff policy. By raising the price of foreign goods, tariffs can encourage consumers to buy American-made products, supporting local businesses and workers. President Trump took this concept further than any modern president. He wielded tariffs not just as a shield to defend American industries, but as a sword, an economic weapon to force other countries to the negotiating table. Trump argued that for too long, unfair trade practices, especially from China, had undercut American workers, hollowed out factories, and threatened the nation's economic future. He claimed that tariffs were the only way to fight back and restore American strength. By imposing tariffs, Trump said he could level the playing field, making it harder for countries to flood the U.S. market with cheap goods. He believed this pressure would force foreign governments to negotiate better trade deals, ultimately benefiting American workers and businesses. The legal foundation for this bold move came from a little-known law passed in the 1970s. This law gave the president sweeping authority to impose tariffs if he determined that certain imports threatened national security. By declaring America's reliance on foreign goods a security threat, Trump was able to bypass Congress entirely. With the stroke of a pen, he could reshape the nation's trade policy. acting alone, without the usual checks and balances. Critics, however, saw this as a dangerous overreach. They argued that stretching the definition of national security to cover economic concerns gave the president almost unlimited power to wage trade wars, with little oversight or accountability. This approach marked a dramatic departure from decades of U.S. policy. For generations, both Republican and Democratic leaders had championed free trade, believing that open markets fostered prosperity, innovation, and peace. Since the end of World War II, the United States had led the world in building a global trading system. The idea was simple: by lowering barriers and encouraging trade, all nations would benefit, and the risk of conflict would shrink. But Trump shattered that bipartisan consensus. He argued that the costs of free trade, lost jobs, shuttered factories, and struggling communities were simply too high for American workers to bear. His America First message resonated with those who felt left behind by globalization. The tariffs he imposed were a direct challenge to the old order. They were a gamble on economic nationalism, a bet that protecting American industries would lead to a stronger, more self-reliant nation, even if it meant higher prices or strained relations with allies. But the debate was never just about economics. At its core, it was about the limits of presidential power. Could one person, citing national security, reshape the entire economy? Or did this threaten the balance of power that defines American democracy? As the world watched, the Supreme Court prepared to decide whether this bold new approach would stand. The stakes were enormous, not just for trade policy, but for the very question of how much power a president should have in shaping the nation's future. The tariff case's journey to the Supreme Court was a fierce legal battle over presidential power. The core question: could the president impose sweeping tariffs without Congress's explicit approval? Opponents argued the Constitution gives Congress, not the president, the power to regulate trade and taxes. Lawsuits from businesses relying on imports quickly followed Trump's tariffs. They claimed the administration's national security justification was a pretext for economic protectionism. Lower courts issued conflicting rulings, deepening the confusion. The administration insisted the law gave the president broad discretion to define security threats. They warned that limiting this power would weaken national defense. The dispute became a classic separation of powers clash. With billions at stake and no clear legal answer, the Supreme Court stepped in to resolve the issue. The stage was set for a decision that would define the boundaries of presidential authority. The world expected a decisive Supreme Court ruling. Instead, it got silence. For months, anticipation had built up around the court's decision on the high-stakes tariff case. Legal experts, business leaders, and ordinary citizens alike watched the calendar, certain that a verdict would soon bring clarity to a world thrown into economic uncertainty. But as the days ticked by, the silence from the highest court in the land became deafening. As January 2026 passed, the tariff case was missing from the court's decisions. The docket remained unchanged, and the courtroom, usually a stage for historic pronouncements, stood empty, its benches gathering dust. Each passing week without a ruling only deepened the sense of unease. Each opinion day without a verdict deepened global frustration. International traders, already battered by months of uncertainty, watched as markets fluctuated wildly. Investors hesitated, unsure whether to buy, sell, or simply wait. The world's financial pulse seemed to skip a beat every time the court failed to act. This wasn't normal judicial pacing, it was an unsettling delay in a case with massive economic stakes. The echo of footsteps in the empty Supreme Court hallways mirrored the growing anxiety in boardrooms and factories across the globe. The usual rhythm of justice had been disrupted, replaced by a tense, unpredictable pause. Speculation swirled. Was the court divided? News panels buzzed with theories. Some believed the justices were locked in a bitter ideological struggle, unable to find common ground. Others wondered if the case's complexity had simply overwhelmed the court's ability to reach a timely decision. Was a justice writing a major dissent? Rumors circulated about lengthy opinions and sharp disagreements behind closed doors. Legal scholars pored over every clue, searching for signs of a breakthrough or a breakdown. Or were they waiting for a political solution? Some speculated that the justices were giving Congress time to act, hoping lawmakers would resolve the crisis before the court was forced to weigh in. The line between law and politics seemed to blur as the stalemate dragged on. Whatever the reason, the effect was paralysis. Across industries, projects stalled and hiring froze. Companies put expansion plans on hold, unable to predict what tomorrow might bring. The court's hesitation amplified uncertainty, undermining the rule of law that businesses depend on. The very foundation of economic stability, predictable, impartial justice, seemed to be slipping away. It was as if referees walked off the field during the final play, leaving everyone in limbo. The rules of the game were suddenly unclear, and no one knew when, or if, the whistle would blow again. The delay wasn't about complexity but the court's inability to resolve the issue quickly. Lawyers and litigants waited, their cases frozen in time, as the clock ticked on with no end in sight. Markets stayed on edge. Companies like McCormick cited tariffs as a major obstacle to profits. Every earnings call became a guessing game, with executives forced to admit they had no answers for shareholders. Businesses couldn't plan pricing or production with confidence. Supply chains frayed, and warehouses sat empty as managers waited for a signal that never came. For them, the court's silence was a real barrier to growth. Small business owners, already stretched thin, faced impossible choices: cut staff, raise prices, or risk everything on a future that seemed more uncertain by the day. The verdict that never came became its own kind of judgment, one of continued chaos. The absence of a decision was itself a message. Uncertainty would rule, at least for now. The world held its breath, waiting for a resolution that always seemed just out of reach. In homes, offices, and trading floors around the globe, people watched and waited, hoping that tomorrow would finally bring the clarity they so desperately needed.